On August 8, 1588, God sent the wrong wind, and England ceased to exist as a Protestant nation. For 7 days, the English fleet had harried the Spanish Armada up the Channel, using superior gunnery and ship handling to prevent the Duke of Medina Sidonia from linking with the invasion force waiting in Flanders. On August 7th, fireships sent the Spanish formation scattering from its anchorage at Calais. Victory seemed certain. The Armada was disorganized, demoralized, running low on ammunition. All that remained was to finish the destruction off Gravlines and send the remnants fleeing into the North Sea. Then the wind shifted. A sudden southwesterly gale, the kind that builds without warning in the narrow waters between England and the continent, caught the English fleet in open water, while the Spanish ships found shelter in the lee of the Flemish coast near Dunkirk. Sir Francis Drake and Lord Howard of Effingham watched helplessly as their vessels scattered, some driven onto sandbanks, others forced to run before the storm into the North Sea. The Channel lay open. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. Within 48 hours, Alexander Farnese, Duke of Parma, began loading his 30,000 veteran soldiers onto barges and transport ships. These were not raw conscripts, but the finest infantry in Europe, men who had spent years fighting the Dutch rebels, hardened by siege warfare and brutal winter campaigns. The very force that England's entire naval strategy had been designed to stop was now crossing the Channel unopposed. What no one in London understood yet, what would only become clear in the desperate weeks ahead, was that the Spanish had planned for exactly this moment. The Duke of Parma's army landed near Margate on August 12, 1588, meeting only scattered resistance from local militias. Elizabeth had prepared for invasion. She had given her famous speech at Tilbury, declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king. The trained bands of the southern counties had mustered. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, commanded what forces could be gathered, but trained bands were not professional soldiers, and Leicester's army was outnumbered and outclassed. The Battle of Tilbury lasted less than 4 hours. Spanish tercios, the seemingly unbreakable infantry formations that had dominated European battlefields for decades, advanced with methodical precision against English lines that broke and reformed and broke again. Leicester extracted perhaps half his force and retreated northwest, beginning what would become a guerrilla campaign in the Midlands that would last years but never threaten Spanish control. Elizabeth fled London on August 15th, traveling north under guard toward the uncertain safety of the Earl of Shrewsbury's estates. She never arrived. Spanish cavalry, moving with a speed that shocked the English nobility, intercepted her party near Leicester on August 23. The Queen of England, who had reigned for 30 years and defied the greatest power in Christendom, was captured in a muddy lane while trying to change horses. London fell without resistance. The city fathers opened the gates rather than face siege and sack. On September 1st, 1588, Spanish soldiers walked unopposed through streets that had known no foreign conqueror since William of Normandy. Elizabeth I was tried for heresy in the very Tower where she had once been imprisoned by her sister Mary. The trial was a careful performance. Philip II of Spain had learned from England's handling of Mary, Queen of Scots, the previous year. A rushed execution created martyrs. Elizabeth was given a formal hearing before a tribunal of bishops and Spanish nobles. She was offered the chance to recant, to accept the authority of Rome, to save her life through submission. She refused. According to accounts that would circulate for centuries in Protestant lands, her final words maintained that she had been a true queen and a true Christian. Elizabeth was beheaded on February 24, 1589, almost exactly 2 years after Mary Stuart had faced the same fate at Fotheringhay. The Reformation in England, begun by her father Henry VIII, sustained by her brother Edward, briefly reversed by her sister Mary, and consolidated during her own long reign, was over. Philip installed his daughter Isabella as Queen of England under a regency council dominated by Spanish advisors. The monasteries began to reopen. The Book of Common Prayer was banned. English Catholics, who had hidden their faith for a generation, emerged to reclaim positions of power. But the England that emerged was not truly independent. It was a satellite of the Spanish Habsburg system, its foreign policy dictated from Madrid, its church subordinate to Rome. The Dutch rebels had always known their survival depended on England. Since 1585, English troops had fought alongside Dutch forces against the Duke of Parma's armies. English money had paid for fortifications, for mercenaries, for the ships that kept Dutch trade flowing. The Earl of Leicester had commanded English forces in the Netherlands before returning home to face the Armada. Now Leicester was a hunted fugitive, England was a Spanish possession, and the full weight of Habsburg military power turned toward finishing what Parma had begun. Amsterdam fell in January 1591 after a brutal siege. The great banking houses and trading companies that had made the city wealthy were forced to relocate or face confiscation. Some merchants fled to the Baltic, to Swedish and Danish ports that remained Protestant. Most submitted. The United Provinces, which had seemed on the verge of winning their independence, were reabsorbed into the Spanish Netherlands under terms designed to prevent any future rebellion. The human cost was enormous. Thousands fled north. Those who remained faced the Inquisition's scrutiny. The tolerant, cosmopolitan society that had been emerging in Holland, a society that would have welcomed Spinoza and Rembrandt and Vermeer, never came into being. The consequences of the Dutch collapse would ripple outward for generations. But first, the Habsburgs turned their attention to the last great obstacle to their European hegemony. Henry of Navarre had been fighting for the French crown since 1584. As a Huguenot, a Protestant, he faced the opposition of the Catholic League, backed by Spanish gold and Spanish troops. In the real timeline, he would have eventually converted to Catholicism with the famous quip that Paris was worth a mass, then spent decades rebuilding French power. But that timeline assumed a France that could balance between Habsburg and non-Habsburg powers, that could look to Protestant England and the Dutch Republic as counterweights to Spanish might. In a Europe where England had fallen and the Dutch were crushed, Henry had no such options. He converted in 1593, as he might have done regardless, but the conversion came with conditions that left France humiliated. The Treaty of Lyon in 1595 ceded border territories to Spanish control, committed France to suppress Huguenot worship, and established what amounted to Spanish veto power over French foreign policy. The Habsburg ring around France, Spain to the south, the Spanish Netherlands to the north, Spanish allies in Italy and Germany was complete. France would remain nominally independent. French kings would still sit in Paris. But for more than a century, no major French initiative would proceed without Spanish approval. With England and the Netherlands broken, the Atlantic belonged to Spain. The Spanish had always claimed vast territories in the Americas, but their actual colonization had focused on Mexico, Peru, and the Caribbean, regions rich in silver and native populations that could be forced to extract it. The eastern seaboard of North America had seemed less promising, a land of forests and rivers without obvious mineral wealth. Now that changed. With no English or Dutch competition, Spain expanded systematically northward from Florida. Santa Elena, a modest settlement that had struggled for decades, became a major port. Jesuit missions spread along the coast and up the great rivers. By 1620, Spanish settlements dotted the coastline from the Florida Keys to the St. Lawrence. There would be no Jamestown, no Plymouth Rock, no Massachusetts Bay Colony. The English colonists who might have fled religious persecution had no Protestant England to flee from. Many converted, some escaped to Scandinavia, most simply lived and died under the restored Catholic order. The entrepreneurs who might have sought fortunes in Virginia had no charter companies to fund their ventures. The land that would have become the United States became instead the northern frontier of New Spain. The 17th century under Habsburg dominance was stable, prosperous, and profoundly conservative. Spanish became the language of European diplomacy, displacing the Latin of the medieval Church and the French that might otherwise have achieved that status. Spanish literature, Spanish art, Spanish theology dominated educated discourse from Lisbon to Vienna to the new colonial cities of the Americas. The generation of English writers who might have included Shakespeare and Marlowe and Johnson produced instead devotional poetry and translations of Spanish classics. Mexico City grew to rival Madrid itself as a center of culture and learning. The silver that flowed from Potosí and Zacatecas funded universities, cathedrals, and bureaucracies across 3 continents. The Habsburg system, for all its inefficiencies, maintained peace across most of Europe for longer than any political arrangement since the Roman Empire. But peace came at a cost. Innovation slowed. The scientific revolution that might have flourished in Protestant universities and Dutch printing houses found less fertile ground under inquisitorial oversight. The economic dynamism that competition between European powers might have generated never materialized. The empire expanded, but it did not transform. Protestant thought survived only in Sweden and Denmark, marginal kingdoms on the edge of a Catholic continent. The Reformation had not been extinguished, but it had been contained. In the year 1776, when American colonists might have declared that all men are created equal, the viceroyalty of New Spain stretches from Patagonia to Hudson Bay. There are no 13 colonies, there is no Continental Congress, there is no George Washington leading ragged troops across the Delaware, no Thomas Jefferson drafting words about self-evident truths. The ideas of the Enlightenment exist, but they circulate in coded manuscripts and private conversations, not in public declarations that inspire revolutions. The world that emerged from the wind shift of August 1588 is not a dystopia. Millions live their lives in reasonable comfort under Spanish colonial administration. The cities of the Americas are architectural marvels, their churches and plazas built with silver, extracted at terrible human cost, but creating genuine beauty. The cultural achievements of the Spanish Golden Age, extended and amplified by a century of uncontested dominance, have produced literature and art that rival anything the fragmented Europe of the real timeline might have created. But it is a world without the ferment of competing powers, without the Protestant emphasis on individual conscience that would have reshaped Western thought, without the parliamentary traditions that would have evolved in an independent England. It is a world where order has triumphed over liberty, where stability has been purchased through uniformity. In the real timeline, the wind blew from the southwest, but it blew 2 days later, scattering the Armada rather than the English fleet. Elizabeth survived. The Dutch won their independence. France remained a great power. England became Britain and built an empire of its own. The modern world, with all its chaos and creativity and contradictions, emerged from that competitive cauldron. History turned on a shift in the wind. It always does.